Everyone. It's me, David Chen. I'm here with Melissa Taminga, otherwise known as One April Day, on Twitter and a few other places. Melissa, how are you doing today?
I'm doing pretty well. Kind of a nice Sunday afternoon, although I feel like the days of the week kind of blend into each other now.
Indeed. And we are doing a different type of thing today. We're trying to broadcast across all different platforms using a new platform called Restreamio. And so I'm giving it a shot, and it doesn't really look like it's working super well. I mean, I am
Great.
live on Periscope right now, and I think I'm live on YouTube, is my guess. But I don't know that. Yeah, I'm live on YouTube, but I didn't tweet out from my Twitter account, so that's bad. And
Okay.
I'm also not live on Facebook, and I'm actually worried about that Facebook component. Oh no, no, I'm live
Right.
on
Oh,
Facebook. Okay,
I
we're
think I
live.
see you on Twitter too.
Yeah, we're on
Yeah.
Twitter. Okay, so it just takes a second. All right, cool. Well, anyway, for those who are just tuning in, basically, I am trying to do these broadcasts with Melissa to talk about what is happening in the world right now from the perspective of COVID and also from the perspective of politics, and to just process what's happening, to talk about how we are coping with the news, to talk about how we are like adapting our lives to adjust to what's happening. Uh, I was just talking to Melissa before the show that in general, when I look at my YouTube channel or when I look at like my podcast list, I would say the vast majority of that content doesn't really address COVID in the way that normal people are thinking about it. You know,
Right.
like people like you and me, we're thinking like, okay, we're reading the news, we're processing it, and we're trying to figure out how to integrate that news into our lives. Like, oh, it spreads via
Exactly.
droplets, or oh,
Mhm.
you can't, like we must social distance. Like, how do you interact with friends? That kind of stuff. And so we wanted to just kind of do a broadcast where we're just talking about like processing that information and figuring out how to make it work for us. So,
Yeah.
um, if you are interested in subscribing to updates, we're currently broadcasting across all platforms, but we do have a YouTube channel, and I'm going to put it up on the screen, the URL down below. It's at youtube.com/uncertain times, which, by the way, is the temporary name of this endeavor, Uncertain Times, because it's uncertain times that we live in right now. So you go to youtube.com/uncertain times and subscribe. You'll get new broadcasts, new videos. Make sure you hit the notification icon, and you'll be sure to receive an update whenever we broadcast live, which is going to be hopefully multiple times a week. So
Yes.
that is what is happening with these broadcasts. That's what we're going to be trying to do. And I'm also curious to see how this Restreamio thing works on Facebook and YouTube. We're on Twitch as well. We're on Twitter and Periscope. So curious to see how the comment system works. But if you comment on any of
Mhm.
those, I think I can see them in my window, and we'll put them up on the screen and talk about them later on in the broadcast. All
Right.
right. So Melissa, today is August 2nd, 2020.
Yes.
And let's talk about some of the stuff that's happened even since the last broadcast. So this article
Right.
hit the New York Times. It's called 25,000 Pod Schools, How Well-to-Do Children Will Weather the Pandemic. Or I guess it's like $25,000 Pod Schools is a better way to pronounce that. And I'll read just a little bit from the article here about how parents are forming individual pods. Here we go. For a slice of enterprising American parents with resources, so-called pod schools have arrived. Cropping up all over, these small educational groups aim to offset the looming wreckage of a national experiment in distance learning. Among the many options are Schoolhouse, based in New York City, which is offering micro schools around the country, and Whiz Kids, based in nearby Irvington. The idea of learning pods, both formally organized by outfits like the Hudson Lab, as well as more ad hoc parent-run variations, appears to be speaking to parents who feel that government agencies and school districts have failed to plan for their children. And then I'll go on a little bit for like describing how this works. Parents will form groups of 3 to 10 children, usually in the same grade. The pods will meet each day from 9 a.m. to 2 p.m. in a parents' basements or cordoned off living room, or perhaps somewhere outdoors to learn from a teacher provided by the Hudson Lab. Each pod for grades K through 4 will cost $125,000 for the academic year, or $68,750 for a 5-month commitment. With 5 children in a pod, for example, the cost per student will run $13,750 per semester. More children in a pod, the lower the cost per student. But of course, the higher the risk. So
Right.
we mentioned pods last time on our last
We
broadcast,
did.
which again, you can find at youtube.com/uncertain times. I put a little logo on the bottom there. And we had talked, I made a reference to how it perpetuates kind of existing inequalities,
Right.
wealth inequalities in our society.
Mhm.
And so I'm curious what you think of this idea of pods.
I mean, at the ideological level, this seems like a great idea. I mean, if you can have kids continuing to learn and on some level socialize, that seems like the most ideal thing for everyone. But I think the most troubling thing about this, of course, is simply that this is just for a few select elites. I mean, I don't know any people in my own life that can pay $100,000 a year for children to go to a school like this. So,
Well,
as
125,000 for the whole thing. 13,000 per semester per student,
per
let's say.
semester, okay,
Yeah.
gotcha.
Yeah.
Yeah, but still, 13,000 per semester. So there's what, two semesters? I mean, $26,000 a year then for one student. We couldn't afford that, and we're middle class people. So it is just one of those things where it seems like the pandemic on so many levels is both highlighting the inequalities in our society as well as exacerbating those inequalities. And I mean, I guess in some way, do I begrudge these parents if they have the ability to do that? Uh, I mean, if of course every parent wants to give the best thing that they can for their children, but also I think it makes me wonder about, when you have a certain amount of wealth or privilege, then how do you spend that wealth or privilege? And I think we're also going to talk about this another article later about this, a superintendent in just a small school district in Arizona, and the dichotomy between these parents and their special little pods as opposed to the superintendent who is trying to help these underserved, underprivileged students across an entire district. It just feels so gross. These pod schools. And I think for my own children, I've thought about that too. If someone were to say, "Hey, there's this pod school that you could go to that is maybe affordable," I would probably consider it. But also, again, I continue to have to think about and wonder about what are the ethical considerations when it comes to these choices that you're making for your children. I think a lot of parents feel justified in making a lot of these choices because you feel like I will do anything for my own kids, so it feels justified. So there's this, I'm sacrificing the community for my own child. So there's a kind of a justification that happens there, and I think that's hard to weigh, but we have to begin to weigh those things if we actually all want everyone to live in a more just and equal society.
I think what you're saying is all true, and I think that there is this. I've read about this idea of like sometimes your ideals collide with what is best for your children.
Right.
Like this is a common thing that I think progressives have to deal with is
Yeah.
like if you're talking about how it's gross, but do you think it's at least possible that if you were very wealthy that you would do one of these? Like if this was the best option for your children, right? Like
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'm saying like if I had the opportunity to do that, and would you really say no?
right.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, it's like bad for society, probably,
Right.
right?
Exactly.
So,
Exactly.
but this is the unfortunate situation we've all been put in, or many people have been put in, is they need to decide whether to take care of themselves or do what's best for society.
Right. Exactly.
Which I think is probably a good summation of the Trump administration. But you were talking
Yeah.
about this superintendent article. So this is an article that was published in the Washington Post that's been spreading around a lot today.
Yeah. It was
So,
published yesterday.
yeah, so
Yeah.
Washington Post is doing this series called Voices from the Pandemic. And they published this piece yesterday, and the headline is, "I'm sorry, but it's a fantasy." And it's like Jeff Gregorich, Gregorich, superintendent, on trying to reopen his school safely. It's a very moving, powerful piece about
Yeah.
one superintendent's challenges right now, right? That he basically is faced with a no-win situation, as far as I can
Right.
tell, right? Because
Yep.
as he puts it, there's nothing else to cut. He says here, quote,
Yeah.
"This is your classic one-horse town. I'm superintendent, high school principal, and sometimes the basketball referee during recess. It's a skeleton staff. We pay an average salary of $40,000 a year. I've got nothing to cut. We're
Yeah.
buying new programs for virtual learning and trying to get hotspots and iPads for our kids. 5% of our budget is hundreds of thousands of dollars. Where is that going to come from? I might lose teaching positions or basic curriculum unless we somehow get up and running." Right? Because if they don't get up and running, this, he says, quote, "It's a high needs district in middle of nowhere, Arizona." And so if he doesn't get up and running, then it's going to be in a bad situation. But then if he gets up and running, obviously, like, he describes a scenario where he tried to do like some remote teaching with some teachers, like three teachers in class
For like a summer school type
for a summer
thing.
school, working together, like being extremely careful, socially distancing,
Doing everything
taking
they're
every
supposed to do.
precaution.
Yep.
And I think one of them got COVID, right?
And I think she died, didn't she?
I think that's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, and that's the problem. Here he says, quote,
Yeah.
"Mrs. Bird did everything right. She followed all the protocols. If there's such a thing as a safe, controlled environment inside a classroom, that was it. We had 3 teachers sharing a room so they could teach a virtual summer school. They were so careful. Mrs. Bird is a master teacher. They checked their temperatures. All 3 of them wore masks. At first, she thought it was a sinus infection. That's what the doctors told her, but it kept getting worse. I'm skipping ahead. Mrs. Bird fought for a few weeks until she couldn't anymore." And he talks about going over it in his head 1,000 times, like, what precautions do we miss? What more could I have done? I don't have an answer. These are 3 responsible adults in an otherwise empty classroom, and they worked hard to protect each other. We still can control it. That's what scares me. So he's facing a conflict between reopening schools and like probably infections running rampant in some way, in uncontrollable ways, or if he closes school down, then there are like implications from that as well that are really negative, right?
Right. Not only their students, but I think it says if the governor has told us that we have to open our schools to students on August 17th, or else we miss 5% of our funding. And and this is a school that has almost no funding anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. So you are an educator yourself. Like, as you're reading this, what are the emotions you're experiencing?
I mean, it's horrific because again, as he basically comes to at the end of the piece, there is no right choice here. There is absolutely no thing to do that's within the realm of possibility that is not going to hurt someone, whether that's teachers or students or whoever it is. And so it just seems like this is really just an expression of there is no good way to do this, and these are my emotions about this, and it seems to me that that's one of the major things that it's just getting kind of these individuals like the superintendent who are having to make these impossible decisions, knowing that he's deciding like someone's life and death, really, at a literal level. And the letter that we got from our superintendent this past week, he doesn't have the same pressure simply because we live in Washington State, but you could hear between the lines the absolute just the trauma of him trying to make these decisions that, again, there's no possible way to make the right decision. And he, again, someone who's a superintendent who's done it for 20 years, he loves his students, he loves his teachers. So this is not only his career, this is deeply personal. And like he said, too, it's a pretty small community. Everybody knows everybody else. So whatever decisions you make, you will know the people that you impacted. And I just, I can't wrap my head around the sort of horror of being in that position.
Yeah, I think that really to me it's a failure at the government level that we're forcing people like
Exactly.
Jeff Gregorich to make these decisions, right? Like
Yeah. Yeah.
it shouldn't need to be something that he makes. We should like
Yeah.
ideally there's like a national plan or a state, even a statewide plan of like here's how
Right.
we're going to do things,
Yep.
and it doesn't feel like that's materializing at all, right?
Yeah. Yeah. But so the buck is stopping up there rather than with these individual people. Well, the burden of the lives and deaths of these students and teachers is all on their lap.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Anything else you want to say about this piece, or shall we move on?
Um, yeah. I mean, there's probably a lot to say, but we could we could move on. It is a really great piece. I would recommend everyone read it. It's relatively short, but just really powerful.
Yeah, and I'll link to everything in down below, wherever on YouTube specifically in the description. All the links will be there. So, a couple other things I wanted to highlight. One is there is an article at Slate that I thought everyone should be aware of.
Yeah.
The headline of the article is "The Coronavirus is Airborne. Keep saying it." It's a jarring message and the right one. And this is something we talked about in our last broadcast as well. But basically,
Yeah.
people aren't really. I don't think it is. This is widespread knowledge yet, right?
Right. Exactly. Hmm.
So what this author, Michael A. Fisher, says is, quote, "The updated message that needs to reach people is, in addition to visible routes of transmission like getting coughed on or touching a surface and then your face, COVID-19 can spread through the air we breathe, particularly indoors. Or more succinctly, the coronavirus is airborne. Repeat it. Tell your friends and family. We should be hearing it on the radio and podcasts. Hey, like this one. Seeing it in PSAs on TV and YouTube. It should be written on little signs that we must pass as we carefully make our way to the grocery store. While we don't need to worry about infectious clouds of coronavirus roaming an open beach, the outside's pretty safe if you can stay socially distanced. We do need to be really worried about encountering the virus anywhere there are people in poorly ventilated spaces because the coronavirus is indeed airborne." End
Yeah.
quote.
Yeah. And I think there's been kind of a strain. I think that there's been a conflation of the idea of droplets, right, from sneezing or coughing and airborne. So, but that sneezing and coughing, these are like larger droplets, right? And then the airborne is simply just breathing in and out. So each individual particle has a smaller viral load. But if you're in an enclosed space with poor ventilation for a certain period of time, it's going to be the same impact as if you were sort of sneezed on or coughed on. So this has implications for things, of course, like schools and restaurants. So even if you're socially distanced from someone,
Yeah.
you will be eventually breathing the same air, and that would be the same as then actually being close to someone. So one of the problems, of course, right, is that people are saying, well, wear a mask, be this socially distant, this far apart, but that social distance doesn't actually have an impact if you're in this enclosed space for a certain period of time, because you'll get the same viral load as if you were standing next to the person and they sneezed.
Yeah, and I think you shared an article during our last broadcast where even like outdoors there's risk if you're like in the same space for an extended period of time, or if you
Right.
relax the social distancing, or if you relax the masks, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Anyway, I think it is something that we need to that people need to talk about more. I don't think it's like at the forefront of everyone's mind of how it's transmitted, because
I don't think
I mean,
it
one of the
is, yeah.
things, one of the weird things about how this is all played out is that science typically works in a similar fashion to what we've seen, which is
Exactly.
in fits and starts, and like, oh, we have this information, and now we have this information that's slightly
Yeah.
better, and now we have this information that's slightly better, and usually that all happens in journals over the course of like years, and the
Right.
public
And we
is not exposed.
eventually,
Yeah, and we
we
eventually are like,
find out
oh
the
yes,
conclusion.
that's what it
Yeah.
is. But because of the fact that this is impacting virtually every human on Earth right now, we are
Yeah.
watching science unfold in this fashion, and it is very disorienting, and it's
Yeah.
not how we're used to processing information, and
Right.
so it's hard to adjust because like an average human can only pay attention to like X number of things at a time,
Mm.
and so it's hard. It's hard to like.
Yeah.
I've been, cleaning my like cleaning my groceries for the last 3 to 4 months, and
Right.
we still will do that on occasion, but like
Hmm.
now we need to adjust to like, okay, like the masks are more important, staying outdoors is more important, like all these
Right.
things are more important.
Hmm.
But it's what we got to do until we learn more information that negates this,
Right.
perhaps.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think one of the frustrating things to see too is it's completely understandable that people would think, well, first you said no masks, now you're saying masks, how can we trust you? And if you're thinking about this, the macro level of how science works, well, that's exactly what you would expect. You would expect them to be a theory, and then actually, no, we refined that theory, and now we need to change it to adjust to the evidence, and now we need to have another iteration of the theory. And so, like, if you were thinking about science on this macro level, those iterations and those various evolutions, you would think of them as good things. But just on that kind of micro level day to day, when you're trying to get messaging out to a general population, it feels like the science, or you can't trust these voices because it sounds like you're contradicting what you just said. And of course, when you have leadership from the top that is not explaining to people, well, this is how the science works, but they're also uh, underscoring the idea that there's some kind of a conflict or hypocrisy going on, then that makes people all the more distrustful of whatever the newest iteration of the scientific evidence is. And and so it just seems like we're in just a kind of a really difficult situation in our country where people don't know who to listen to. And when the next bit of information comes out, they're like, well, you just said something different the other day, so why should I trust this new thing that you're saying?
Yeah.
Um,
By the way, gravity is fake in the chat room says social distancing does still have an impact,
yes, of
just not as
course.
good as if not airborne. We don't want to give folks the idea that airborne means social distancing is useless. So I just want to
Right, of course.
make
Yeah, yeah.
that 100%
Mhm.
clear.
Yeah. Yeah,
Um,
because it can still the sneeze or the cough can still carry that droplet, right? And if you're closer, then it will get you. And
yeah,
if you're farther away, it won't. Yeah.
yeah. So still socially distanced, and I mean, I think a lot of scientists have still said like, "Yep, washing your hands, all that stuff is still very
Also that
valuable,"
too. Right.
but it's
Hmm.
not necessarily the primary method of transmission.
Yeah.
Um,
Oh, we just need to
so
keep adding these layers
yes,
of how it can be transmitted. Yeah.
so this kind of reminds me of this other piece I read this week in Dallas Voice. Did you hear
Hmm.
about this piece in Dallas Voice?
I don't think so.
So this piece, I first learned about this piece from an interview that this writer did with Houston Public Radio.
Okay.
The headline of the article in Dallas Voice is "A Harsh Lesson in the Reality of COVID-19." It's written by a columnist named Tony Green, and I was listening to this interview, and it was very fascinating because Tony Green sounds like a fairly reasonable dude. He's a Trump voter,
Okay.
which is not something I support, but he didn't sound like a fringe human
Hmm.
being or anything like that. He didn't sound
Sure.
like a kook. He didn't seem like he believed in QAnon or anything.
Hmm.
There was a few things that stuck out to me about what he said. Number one is that he didn't seem to consume any kind of mainstream media of any kind. Like I think he said like he doesn't really
Interesting.
watch TV anymore or anything like
Hmm.
that. So I thought that was interesting. He seemed to get most of his news from like social media and Facebook.
Hmm.
And he believed that COVID-19 was a scam. And so he says,
Wow.
believing the hoax, believing the pandemic to be a hoax, my partner and I hosted family members on Saturday, June 13th. On June 14th, I woke up sick. And you end up learning that like many people from his family got sick.
Hmm.
Several people had to go to the hospital, and his father-in-law's mother died on July 1st. of
Wow.
COVID-19/pneumonia. And he
Hmm.
says here, quote, "The chaplain wanted the family to break the news to my father-in-law, and he learned how his mother lay on her deathbed and then drifted off without any family by her side, even though he was in the room next to hers. On the day of her funeral, which is July 14th, 5 more of our family members tested positive. That evening, my father-in-law was put in a ventilator," end quote.
Mm.
And he talks about how he felt extremely guilty about a kind of uh,
Being
inviting people to the party
complicit.
that
Yeah.
caused this. And
Hmm.
first of all, I have to give props to this guy, despite how terrible everything went, for actually writing about this publicly
Sure.
and incurring no small quantity of criticism and dunking and all kinds of like people being angry at him.
Oh,
Like
I'm sure. Yeah.
so I do admire him for that. But it did feel like this piece and his interview in on Houston Public Radio provided like an interesting window into
Hmm.
how a lot of the population thinks about this, which is
Yeah.
we have reached the point, I think, that people do not actually believe this is a thing until
Yeah.
it's 1 degree of separation, right?
Yeah.
Like
Like someone. Mm.
not even someone. I don't even think that is it. I think it's like literally they are like a close family or friend, close
Yeah.
family member or friend. Because I think like if it's like a friend of a friend, I don't even think it's close enough.
Yeah. No,
And
you're probably right. Yeah.
I would say this person actually had like a really good response to it, which is he was introspective and he's like,
Mm.
"I'm wrong. I feel guilty." And many people might not that might not even they might not even do that. They might still like double down in light of
Hmm.
what's going on.
Hmm. Yeah.
But I wanted to share this story because I thought it was extremely tragic, and I didn't know if you had any thoughts on this, because I know you have family members that may feel similarly
Yeah.
to this person, Tony Green, right?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, just hearing that reminds me so much of my own family members. And again, they're intelligent, educated people, but I think, I mean, you have the one element of that they're just on the sort of the political right-hand spectrum of things, so that carries with it its own elements, but even they're not necessarily completely invested. Like they wouldn't have gone to a Trump rally and they don't wear Trump hats and that kind of thing. But they are sort of on the right. And so they're getting, I think, a certain level of information, but also as you're like this, similar to this guy, I think pretty much, like, for example, my mom doesn't really read the news. I mean, she'll kind of maybe scan through the local paper, but she's not constantly keeping up with it. Same with my sisters-in-law. That it's more like they're just living at the daily level of their own lives. And if something big comes, then they will hear about it, but they are not scanning the news every day, and they don't know anyone who has had COVID or been impacted by it. None of them do know anyone personally, either 1 degree or even, just even closer. And so I think that they are, because of the Washington state mandates, they're basically kind of following the rules. But my brother has explicitly said, "I'm not worried about the virus." Which on the I mean, I guess I can understand it on that level if you're not constantly taking in the information about how dangerous it is and how transmissible, you wouldn't really be worried about it. But also, I don't understand how you can look at the death toll, for example, and not really be worried about it. So it is a huge concern. I mean, I just, in my mind, I'm kind of preparing for the same kind of event that um, this piece that you read was talking about, that my family members at some point will have to maybe say the same thing that this person said, because just in terms of their own practices, they're not really, um, following kind of the basic rules. I'm not going to break the Washington state mandates on some level, but also they're still getting together in pretty large family groups. And actually they have a big one coming up this next week, where they're all going to get together and go to the islands, and they have different cabins, but I think they're going to eat together and be outside together. So it's kind of horrifying. It's really hard for me to, I feel like so many emotions about it. I feel angry. I feel distressed. I feel kind of numb. I feel like maybe I shouldn't even think about it because I can't do anything anyway. So it's just so hard um, to navigate.
Well, I'm
this.
very sorry you're having to go through all that, and yeah, I mean, I think that um, maybe you can send them this article and this radio piece,
Yeah, right,
you know?
exactly. Yeah, yeah. Well, the sad
And
thing is, I tried to send them a few things early on that I thought, okay, this is like sounds really nonpartisan. I don't think they'll react to it, but they at some point they were just like not responding to me anymore, and so I don't know. But maybe a part of me is like, well, what can I lose? They'll read it or they don't read it. So maybe if there's a chance that they'll read it, it it might help.
right, right. There's a bit here in this article where Tony Green says, quote, I believe the mainstream media and the Democrats were using the COVID-19 to
Mm.
create panic, crash the economy, and destroy Trump's chances at re-election, end quote. So,
Yeah,
you know,
I've
that's
heard
kind
that a
of,
lot.
that's the
Hmm.
mentality, you know, is that,
Hmm.
and I don't think anything can correct it until
Yeah,
more people die, which is really
yeah,
tragic and unfortunate.
yeah, yeah.
Because that seems to be the only thing that can get people to that is
Hmm.
getting people to finally reconsider their ways.
Right, right. Because one of the things that we're seeing, right, is that your opinion or understanding of what truth is really connected to your identity. And if your identity is connected to these things, you almost can't reject or you can't reject certain things or absorb new ideas that contradict something that's fundamentally what you believe because it's so much a part of who you are. And so there almost has to be the disruption of who you are at this fundamental emotional level for you to take a different step and see something in a new way. And I think that's we're all kind of subject to that. Not just these family members that I'm frustrated with.
So we're getting a comment in the chat says Jewel Klein 2000 says Tony Green did a GoFundMe. On the GoFundMe, it now has a note saying that the family wants him to refund the donations. And actually, if you go to the
Wow.
GoFundMe, he says, quote, it is with a heavy heart and deep regret, but I must inform each contributor that I am compelled to end this fundraiser and refund each donor. Uh, people in the family are displeased with my attempts to provide additional love, support, prayers, and financial contributions in a time of need. Because of their
Mm.
continuous harassment and vindictive behavior, this family member now refuses to accept this money. Um, so anyway, I think
That's
this is
interesting.
this is very sad.
Hmm.
But yeah, I'm reading this. We're doing this live right now. I just Googled Tony Green and GoFundMe, so I think this is the correct
Yeah.
thing. Yeah, this looks like the right one.
Okay.
But anyway, if you Google it, you can find it and see the update yourself.
Hmm.
All right, so we've been talking for a while now. The broadcast appears to be functioning across all platforms. So
Great.
I am seeing a stream of every comment on every
Uh-huh.
single platform right now. So if you
Okay.
have any comments or questions or feedback, feel free to hit me up in the comments, and I'll put it on screen, and we will respond to it. I'm sorry that I like the audio. My audio is a little rough this time. That will be fixed next time. And but overall, this seems to be functioning, and I think we're going to try to do something like this in the future. But yeah, any comments or anything you want us to talk about, hit the chat room. Let us know, and I'll pop up the comment here, and we'll discuss it. Gravity is fake says thanks for the wonderful Periscope. I still miss Quarantine Corner with David and his wife. We'll probably still do. We may still do those on this channel.
Yeah, those are
But
great.
basically, Melissa is somebody who is equally intelligent and articulate, but also happens to have more willingness to broadcast with me.
Uh,
So that's why we're trying to do this regularly. Any other comments people have? Any other questions? Anything people want to discuss? Otherwise, I think this was a successful experiment. I've learned some things, and I do want to point people again to youtube.com/uncertain times, where you can subscribe to these broadcasts, and there's like an archived version of them. You'll get notified when we go
right.
live. We're also on a few other platforms right now. But yeah, anything else you want to talk about, Melissa? Otherwise, I think we can probably wrap this up shortly.
Yeah, I think this is great.
I do,
Uh,
you know, there's, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I did also see this piece in Washington Post. Did you see this? How the Trump campaign came to court QAnon, the online conspiracy movement identified by the FBI as a violent threat.
Oh, I think I saw the headline. I didn't get a chance to read the article.
Yeah, this QAnon thing is really pretty disturbing development in our
It
national
is.
politics.
Yeah.
There's
Yeah.
multiple people who are running for Congress right now who believe in QAnon,
Right.
and probably we'll need to cover it more in depth at another broadcast. But
Hmm.
this article basically identifies kind of some of the ways that the Trump campaign has signaled to QAnon supporters that
Right.
they are on the same team, and it's very very troubling.
It is, yeah, based on some of the things I've read about QAnon. And it's one of those things that I read about and I thought, okay, well, I hope I just could read about this fringe group and then at some point it will just go away. But but yeah, if it's becoming to the level of like it's not just fringe, but it's becoming mainstreamed into what the kind of the Trump platform or the Trump the people in the that are running for office are actually actively courting this group, that becomes a whole different thing. But it feels like the conspiracy is becoming then mainstream, which I don't know, I guess there's conspiracy on many levels already. Even that Dallas Voice piece you read, it was kind of echoing certain kind of conspiracy
Right.
theories, like the Democrats, came up with COVID or whatever.
It's all just kind of part of a spectrum.
It is, yeah.
But quote from this article, quote, the apparent convergence of Trump's inner circle with an ever-widening cohort of QAnon believers is alarming to scholars of extremism and digital communications, some of whom characterize the theory's adherents as a cult. What most troubles
Mm.
analysts is not that McEnany and others responsible for carrying out Trump's agenda are amplifying QAnon, which has permeated right-wing politics. Even more worrisome, these observers say, is that the president's messaging is increasingly indistinguishable from some key elements of the conspiracy theory, end quote. So,
Wow. Yeah. Hmm.
anyway, conversation for another day, but this is something that's continuing to be covered, and I it,
Something to keep an eye on.
it's something to
Yeah.
it's something to keep an eye on. It's a thing it's like a train that's coming from far away that
Yeah.
is gonna get to the station one day,
Hmm.
and we don't know exactly when we'll get to the station, but once it gets here, we know it's gonna be a problem.
Yeah.
I think that something you said earlier in the broadcast that I think bears repeating is this idea of this being a theory where this being a theory where any evidence to the contrary, that the theory is correct, merely
Hmm.
reinforces the theory, and that is just a very dangerous
Exactly.
place to be in general. Of like any
Yeah.
theory, any theory.
Yes,
You
exactly. Hmm.
don't believe in theories where proof that the theory is not true serves as proof that the theory is true, because then
Right.
you cannot escape that discursive reality.
Hmm.
Okay, so hey, there are a couple things that people in the chat want to say. Okay, so Dominga Moronta in from YouTube says he's talking about parents in the pods and stuff like that, and
Hmm.
he mentions that there's this podcast from Serial about this nice white parents.
Yes.
This is a podcast that you started listening to. This is so I think New
Yeah.
York Times recently acquired Serial,
Yeah.
and they
Hmm. I think
launched a
so.
podcast called Nice White Parents. You've
Hmm.
listened to the first episode, right? What
Yeah.
did you think of
Listen to
it?
the first episode. It's really good. It basically traces kind of the inequities in a New York school system. I don't know if the entire series is going to do that, but it basically is talking about how kind of well-meaning, well-intentioned white people, nice white parents, come into a school system. They kind of bring um, their certain expectations and ideas for how to change a system, which they think is going to be good for everyone, but it ends up um, really creating deeper inequities. And these nice white parents don't even realize it, that's what they're doing. So it seems to go along with, again, the kind of the idea of progressives, believing that we're anti-racist and having all these good intentions, but then when you come into to a situation, you don't really understand what's going on at a fundamental level, and what you're bringing to that situation is actually creating these deeper inequities. And it trickles down to how the children interact with each other too. There was, in that first episode, there were some pretty just cringy comments made by the children, where even the children were expressing this idea that now that we have come into the school, we have made things better. The school used to be low performing, and now that we have come, we have made things better in this particular school. So it's these kind of 9-10-year-old children repeating what is essentially comes down to kind of white supremacist ideas that you bring when you're whiteness, you're bringing this something that's better. So it's a really good it's a good show so far. I think it's pretty painful to listen to in some ways because
you consider yourself a nice white parent potentially.
Right, exactly. I mean, I think that I'm looking at the racism in this country and I'm horrified by it and I want to do something, but I think that there has to be such an intense probing of my own kind of intentions, and also thinking about not about what my intentions are, but what is the impact of what I'm doing, because my intentions can be great, but the impact is actually disastrous. And so it's not just being a nice person. It's more thinking about what are the actions that you're taking? What are they particularly doing? So I'm looking forward to the rest of the podcast, and it is a nice, I think, companion piece to these pod schools, and also the work that Nicole Hannah-Jones has done. For example, she has a really good podcast episode on This American Life called "The Problem We All Live With." That's about school segregation. This idea that we think schools segregation is a thing of the past, but actually it's even worse now, and that goes along really well with this particular. I think it will go along with these nice white parents episodes. Really is a nice companion piece to that.
Something I've noticed about a show like Nice White Parents, by the way, is I think that a lot of white people get triggered by the mention of white. Like
Yes,
when I went
absolutely.
to the word, like literally the word white, like when you go to the podcast reviews, I haven't listened to the show. I look forward to it, but I kind of like went to the show to check it out. And you could tell there was just tons of people that were leaving reviews, never having listened to the show,
Right.
just extremely upset at being called out as nice white parents. And I think that's just like a fascinating. It's obviously not something I experience because I'm not white, but it's a fascinating phenomenon. I think that like white people, I think. And stop me if I'm wrong, because you are the only white person in this conversation.
Yeah,
but,
please.
But I think white people like to think of themselves as the default. And
absolutely,
like,
as if it's not a thing.
Right.
It's neutral.
And any time that white is identified specifically as potentially not a default, they get some percentage of them get very upset. And they're so used to being the default that like by identifying it as like something that's white, meanwhile, people of color need to deal with these kinds of demarcations all the time, like every day, microaggressions on the daily, you know what I mean? And so it's just fascinating that like some people can't see a podcast title called Nice White Parents without like leaving a negative iTunes review.
Right, exactly.
But many people of other races obviously have to deal with much more without leaving negative iTunes reviews. Anyway, it is a provocative title, I think.
It is. But I think it has to be identified that way, right?
Yeah. Anyway, so check out the podcast. I've heard it's great. Melissa likes it. And I think that's going to wrap us up for today. But I will just call out one more time. If you are enjoying these broadcasts and want to hear more, hit us up on YouTube. That's where we'll try to drive most people. But we're also on Twitch. We're also on my Facebook page. We're also on Twitter and Periscope. But thanks for tuning in, and I would love to hear any feedback that you all have. Feel free to DM me on Twitter at Dave Chensky, or hit Melissa up on Twitter at 1AprilDay. I'm David Chen. This is Melissa Taminga. Thanks for joining us. We'll be back pretty soon. The next few days, we'll have another broadcast. All right? Be well until then.